Our next presentation is going to be a panel discussion. As they're coming up, I'm going to introduce the moderator, Aimee. The panel is Countless Solutions, Limited Funds, the role of philanthropy in addressing climate change. The moderator is Aimee Hutchinson. She's going to introduce her panelists. Come on up here, Aimee. Aimee's a pretty amazing young woman and has been doing quite a few things. I will let you read her bio. She's with the MacArthur Foundation, a small little foundation you might have heard of. But she also, in her high school, was basically an advocate for the Boulder Bag-Free initiative in 2012, and she's been working for the planet ever since. So.
Thanks so much, Jeff. It's so wonderful to be here today. We have a really wonderful session planned for you all. What I will actually do, Chip has asked me to just take a few minutes for level setting and really share some of the current data on global climate philanthropy for you all, and then we will jump into our panel discussion. So if we could cue up the slides. Great. So one of the biggest questions that we get asked of climate philanthropy is, how much funding are we talking about? How much are foundations actually giving to climate? And one thing that I will say is that we do recognize that the philanthropic sector is quite diverse. It ranges from community and family foundations, individual donors, as well as larger private foundations. And we will be focusing this session on those large foundations, but of course recognize that this is only one slice of the broader philanthropic space. So again, how much funding is actually out there? This is a graphic courtesy of the ClimateWorks Foundation. It shows in the past year, 2017, what leading foundations in the US and Europe gave to in terms of causes. Now, this session will address both climate mitigation and adaptation, but what we know is that mitigation is higher in terms of dollar amounts than adaptation, and in 2017, foundations gave less than 1% to climate mitigation. This is compared to only 6% to the environment, and the more popular causes are, health, education, those sorts of things. So what does that less than 1% actually mean? It is essentially a total of $700 million that went out in 2017, again, from what we can tell of leading foundations in the US and Europe. Now, this does represent a 30% increase from 2015, and $700 million, it sounds like a lot of money. It is a lot of money, but when we actually step back and think about a lot of what has been presented at this conference so far, what we will be hearing this afternoon is actually that, it's on the order of trillions of dollars that are really needed to make a dent in the climate issue. So it's important to recognize that foundation philanthropy is still just a drop in the bucket of what we need to adequately address climate change. So the next question is, who is being funded? What types of organizations are actually receiving that money from foundations? Recently, Matthew Nisbet published a study that was looking at 19 top climate funders in the US and looking at their grant making from 2011 to 2015. It was a total of over $500 million. And what he found was that these 19 foundations gave 41% of their dollars to 20 organizations. So we're seeing a concentration of many of the dollars to a small handful of organizations. This is also true for the general environmental space. The Environmental Grantmakers Association is a member group of many foundations, and in 2013, they found that in general for environmental funding, over half went to 200 organizations, and then for the bottom 5,000 organizations, they only received 18% of the funding. And they're also paying attention to how large the grants are. So when we think about grants that are less than $10,000, it was only 1.4% of the funding for EGA members. Lastly, what work is being funded? So what strategies are climate funders actually focusing on? again, with the Nisbet study, what you can see in this chart, again, these 19 top US climate funders from 2011 to 2015. So we can see that clean energy was a really big emphasis. There was a lot of funding towards communication, mobilization, working on this movement building aspect of the climate space. Some emphasis on natural solutions, what we just heard Colin talk about, as well as fossil fuel reductions, so reducing coal use, for instance, and then also mitigation policy. This would include carbon pricing, as well as other climate policies. What we see that was a smaller emphasis just for these foundations that he looked at was adaptation-specific policy, transportation, as well as low-carbon energy. What that means, what he grouped it as was nuclear energy, carbon capture and storage, and natural gas work. And lastly, this is, again, from the EGA, looking at climate and energy funding in 2015. I know it's a little hard to read, but up at the top is litigation, policy, communications. Actually, in this case, there was not that much emphasis on that. But down at the bottom, the bigger bars you'll see are research, organizing, education, and advocacy. So hopefully that was helpful for folks just to get a little bit of level setting, understand some recent data in the space. And with that, I'm so pleased to introduce our panelists. They are managing the climate and environmental portfolios of some of the largest foundations in the nation. So what I've asked each of them to do is take about 2 minutes to talk about, introduce themselves, as well as answer the question, what do you think is the most exciting development in climate philanthropy in the last year? So Shawn, let's start at the end with you and go down the line.
Great. Shawn Reifsteck. I'm with ClimateWorks Foundation. We're based in San Francisco. We operate globally. We've been around 10 years. This is our 10-year anniversary, and I actually want to thank a couple of my fellow foundation folks here because they helped launch ClimateWorks 10 years ago, and that was the Hewlett Foundation, McKnight Foundation, and the Packard Foundation. Our mission is to mobilize philanthropy to solve the climate crisis, and so that's what we try to do. So we work with a lot of the foundations mentioned in here. We do basically 4 things, what we call our global view function. So it's kind of an intelligence service. We try to provide foundations and philanthropists with information that will help them inform their grant making, where there are abatement potentials, what do funding flows look like, things along those lines. We also design and manage our own portfolio of grant making, so we are a grant making institution ourselves. We focus on global and transnational issues, so things that really do cut across geographies. So we have transportation work, we have sustainable finance work, we work clean energy that has kind of cross-cutting some of the international policy that I'm sure we'll get into. We also work very closely on a convening function. So we organize groups of philanthropy who are interested in going deeper on certain topics. So literally just a funder collaboration function. And then the fourth, which I'm happy to talk more about, is to grow climate philanthropy. So to essentially, even though 700 million is a lot, and we know it's actually probably more than that, it is still in that less than 1% range. So if we believe it's an existential challenge, we should be devoting more resources. So that's what ClimateWorks is about. And then I think it's always good just to say something personal as well. I'm a dad, and that's why I'm doing this work. I've got 3 young kids, and I'm here for them.
Great.
And do you want me to answer? Sorry, do you want me to answer the most
Please
exciting
answer the
thing?
question.
So I'm going to actually say 2 things, if that's okay. And one is 2 years old, but it's important because it's been alluded to today. And philanthropy played a big role in it, and that is the Paris Agreement. So it was a little over a year ago that the U.S. Signaled its intent to withdraw. I'm happy to say we are all still in many ways. We're going to hear about that today. So over the last year, it is the enthusiasm still shown in the U.S. For that. And then the second is actually we are seeing an uptick in philanthropy, not just focused on climate specifically, but adjacent issues that are climate, where climate is the co-benefit. So health and food and ag and a lot of the things we've talked about here. So we're seeing an uptick on things that we care about.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name's Aimee Witteman, and I direct the Climate and Energy Grant-Making Program at the McKnight Foundation. McKnight is a place-based family foundation that's headquartered in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And the focus of our climate and energy grant-making program is in advancing clean energy leadership and climate solutions in the Midwest. The Midwest is the largest greenhouse gas emitting region in the country, and so our hypothesis is that the US and the world won't succeed in slowing climate change if the Midwest doesn't step up and lead on this issue. Woohoo, Midwest. Any other Midwesterners out there? All right, oh yeah, right on. Okay, go Midwest. For a lot of folks, it's like, where's that? So there's a lot of opportunities for us there as well to address this issue. We're pretty flat, really good wind resource, and a surprising good solar resource as well. And so there's been some really positive developments on clean energy leadership in the Midwest. But when I think about some of the developments in the last year in climate philanthropy that I think are really encouraging, despite the sort of overall picture that we have at the federal level, we are seeing leadership from unlikely places. I think we're also seeing growing alignment in philanthropy about our assessment about both what has to happen and how to affect change. So many of us, I think there's sort of growing consensus that we need to be forging a pathway around deep decarbonization, cleaning the energy sector, and powering more of our economy on clean electricity. Another place where there's growing consensus, I think, is our growing understanding of how to affect change. So for a pretty long period of time, predominantly, and as Emma's slide showed, a lot of resources have gone to policy-forward environmental organizations, and they have been essential to helping us get to where we are today. Their work on policy and regulatory reform at the state and federal level has affected clean energy markets in a really significant and important way. But we know it's not enough to get us to where we need to go to address climate and be on a 2-degree path, that we have to accelerate that progress by orders of magnitude. And so we're seeing more funders grow a more diverse, broader coalition, including but beyond environmental groups, where we're funding consumer advocates, labor groups, business organizations, and social justice and racial equity organizations. And I think we're putting more equity at the center of our climate work. And so the result of that is that we're seeing policy solutions that not only advance clean energy, but that also ensure the benefits are being, are really driving towards low-income communities and communities of color. And we're seeing that in the Midwest, in states there, not just on the coasts. And finally, another development that I just need to mention is that we're seeing more foundations exercise a more robust toolkit. So of course, what we do primarily is grant making. That's 5% of the assets that foundations hold. 95% of the endowment is invested in many different things that could be aligned or not aligned with our low carbon goals. And so more foundations, I think, are recognizing their role as actors in private markets and are able to address climate problems using that tool set that we can't reach through grant making, bringing the lessons we're learning from private markets back into philanthropy and grant making. And it just so happens that most of the investments, I can speak for McKnight, that we've made in low carbon areas are our highest performing assets in our portfolio to date. So an exciting development that may be off of your radar when you think of grant making.
Cool. Hi, everyone. How are you doing?
Good.
Good. I'm Erin Rodgers, and I am originally from Houston, Texas. I grew up there in the 70s when air pollution was horrible. I had asthma as a kid, and I often wonder if that horrible feeling of not being able to breathe sort of led me to, in high school, starting to work on environmental issues and social justice issues as a high school student, and propel me into a career that has brought me here today. I joined the Hewlett Foundation based in the Bay Area of San Francisco, of California, about 7 years ago. My first foray into this crazy world of philanthropy after being an advocate my whole life. The Hewlett Foundation has many different programs, but the environment program is pretty squarely focused on trying to do what we can to fund groups in the world's highest emitting countries for global warming pollution to reduce pollution enough to keep global average temperature rise below 2 degrees. So we fund groups in China, India, the EU, and the US predominantly. My portfolio, I direct most of our US grant making, where we're working on a whole range of issues like Aimee and Shawn were just describing, one of which is a predominant focus is building the political will we need to get where we need to go. And I would say we didn't plan this, but I completely agree with my two colleagues so far on the most exciting thing I've seen in philanthropy in the last year is we're finally understanding that we've been so ensconced in our wonky science and data-driven climate bubble, and it was really preventing progress. And so we're really getting much more creative and experimental and inclusive about the ways we're looking at this problem and solution sets and who we're partnering with and aligning with.
Yeah, terrific. Hi, everyone. I'm Dana Bourland with the JPB Foundation, and I'll let you use the powers of Google and the web to find out more about who we are and what we do. But let me share with you a motto that was first said by our president, Barbara Pickauer, that really guides our environment program. And she was known to say at the beginning of starting our foundation in 2011 that, what good is it if Jane can read if Jane can't breathe? And so that's really been a motto that has guided our work. And when I think about breathing, I think about the fact that I'm not doing it very well at altitude or on a stage in front of you all. But on a more serious note, I think of Freddie Gray, poisoned by lead paint in Baltimore, not breathing terribly well, if at all, in the back of a van, handcuffed as the police whipped him back and forth. And I think of the children not able to breathe at our border because we're ripping them away from their parents. And I think of Sharon. Sharon lived most of her life under a bridge. And her mom, at the age of 22, had 5 children. Sharon, at the age of 18, had 2 children. And so as she was living under this bridge, trying to make a life for herself, she was repurposing boxes and blankets and plastic things to make this a more livable space. And in her own words, Sharon has said to me, I often wondered why I could repurpose these things, but I couldn't repurpose my life. But fortunately, through amazing work that's going on across our country, and in this case with Sharon, with groups like Grid Alternatives that have trained 37,000 people, Sharon is now a solar installer. Her future career opportunities are very sunny. And I think that she's able to breathe. She's able to breathe because she has a job, but also because she feels connected to something so much bigger than herself. And she has hope. And so for me, I share with my friends, my colleagues here, that the most exciting thing happening in philanthropy around climate and energy and the environment is that we're recognizing it's not just about CO2. It's about people and the planet. If we wanted to, as a country, even as a room full of people here, if we decided today that we wanted to commit to a different energy future, we could do it. The carbon emission reduction benefits would probably be pretty great. But the systemic inequities that are undermining access to housing, to jobs, to transportation, to food, to financial freedom, those would still be there. And so I get really excited, as we all do, about what I see happening, this growing movement that's powerful, that's well-informed, and that's organized, and that's addressing climate change in a way that is truly delivering a basic human right for us to breathe freely.
Great, thank you all so much. Is my mic on? Okay, great. Thank you all so much for your wonderful introductions. They've touched on many issues that we will hopefully cover today. I have many questions for our panelists, so I'll help guide the conversation for a few minutes, but then we are gonna open it up for a few minutes for questions. So if those of you in the audience could start thinking of things that you wanna ask our panelists, that would be great. The first thing I'd like to start off with is really this premise and something that we would all agree with, that there is no silver bullet to solving climate change. We know that there are many different solutions that are needed to address this issue. So then how can the philanthropic sector continue to broaden the climate solution set that is available? and really start to address some of the gaps that we saw in the pie chart? And then how does this manifest into priorities at your individual foundations?
I'll go. One of the things I've heard of, I got in Saturday, went for a nice hike. It's beautiful here. But one of the things I've noticed from Monday till now is how excited we all are to be in this room together, and the discussion of this being a community and this being a network. And so there's not a silver bullet. I don't even like that metaphor. But what we're investing in, I think what we're all curiously investing in, is the power of networks. Because that kind of frees me up, sitting in my seat as a philanthropist, to pick something that I think is right, or that I think is going to win the day. But if we can divert some of the resources, as you saw, that are going to some of our biggest environmental organizations, and start directing more of that to organizations that have networks, that really believe in the power of networks, and that have affiliates working at the ground across the country, I think that is one way to spread our resources. The power of networks is, we heard it with a different kind of network in terms of blockchain, but it can leverage our dollar so many more times than picking one organization to do one thing right. So that's where we're interested in at JPB.
Yeah, I'll pick up on that, because I was also musing about this metaphor of the silver bullet versus a lot of themes that have been coming out of the conference so far around networks. And I do think there's this tension, and it exists in climate philanthropy as well, between the silver bullet or the individual and the collective, between centralized solutions and decentralized solutions. And in a way, this is all between liberty and justice. I think those sort of fit into those categories as well. I think philanthropy is struggling with these tensions. And I think, in a way, we need a little bit of both. We do need to empower heroes to take on a whole bunch of different silver bullets. And we've all heard them on the stage today, champions for these different kinds of solutions. But at the same time, Reverend Durley opened our convening yesterday by saying, any movement worth its salt is connecting to something greater than ourselves, something greater than the sum of our parts. And to me, that means we all have to be fostering a healthy ecosystem where all of these individual efforts are starting to connect with networks and amplifying each other and not canceling each other out. And one way I just wanted to take a minute to go through a couple specifics on how I see this playing out specifically with philanthropy and climate right now. So in order to meet the Paris goals that Shawn was mentioning earlier, which that milestone, that deadline is 2025. So that's right, 7 years from now. Here's what we need to do just in the US to be on track for that. About 1/3 of our electricity will need to come from renewable energy by then. We're at 10% now. About half of today's coal-fired power has to come offline or the emissions have to be fully captured. At least 1/4 of our passenger car and truck sales have to be fully electric, up from 1% now. About 80% of all our new residential water and space heaters have to be electric, not gas. And if you want to talk about land use and efficiency not being sexy, how about electric water heaters? and we're going to have to sell those at the same rate that we're selling cell phones and deploying the internet to meet that target. Fuel economy of the cars we have now cannot be lowered, even though Trump's trying to lower the standards. On and on and on. So that's a heavy, heavy lift, and we need the Lone Rangers out on each of those issue areas with their bullets. But I think what philanthropy also is doing more of now that's exciting is we're trying to think about what are the systems, what's the systems approach that helps accelerate all that work at exponential rates, and what can we fund to empower those systems changes? And those systems are political will. It's so important, culture, political will. We saw it just today with the announcement that Trump just made about rescinding the family separation policy at the border. That was due to mobilization and political will. We need to do, Maggie Fox was talking about this yesterday, much better at storytelling, narrative building. We're getting better at that. Building the connective tissue that can actually undergird all these networks that we need. Someone's got to pay for and build that. We've got to multi-solve, as Dana was talking. How do we deliver benefits across a range of issues and remove barriers like racism and sexism that hold us back so much? And finally, how do we use philanthropic dollars to leverage 10, 100, 1,000 times that small amount in private and public funding? So we're working on all of that, and I think the more we can do both silver bullets and systems, the better we'll be.
Fantastic. You know, it sounds great, all this systems thinking and using networks. And we know that there's a lot of solutions required, but we also have to imagine that there's some issues that we need to coalesce around. Again, given the small amount of dollars in the philanthropic space. So I wonder if some of you could just popcorn some current and future opportunities that we've seen in the philanthropic space for collaboration and for leveraging more dollars towards a particular event or strategy.
Yeah, I'll start, but others should jump in. So, and actually I'll tie it to your last question as well. So if we were sitting here 10 years ago, and some of you were, we were on a trajectory in that 5 to 6 degrees Celsius range. That's where emissions were headed. And we were the wonks and such trying to convince everybody we should do something. So we bent that curve, right? We're down into that 3.5, which is awful. It's still awful and a long way to go. But I say that because there are some new time horizons that matter. And so we know we essentially have to peak in the next few years, 2020 essentially. We also know we have to be at, essentially net zero by 2050. And then we have to spend the second half of the century, if not before, with deep, deep negative emissions. I say that because I think what we're coalescing around is these different time horizons have different strategies engaged with them. So there are deep pushes that got us to the Paris Agreement that then put forward efforts that would allow us to get close to that peaking in 2025. We're beginning to look at what needs to happen in deep decarbonization for the 2050, and so we're actually organizing as a community more around this. Our organization just hosted last week about 100 folks in San Francisco focused on 2050. And then as we've heard here today as well, we as a community have not done a very good job of funding in non-energy space and in negative emissions related work. And so I think there is some coalescing around what we've done over the last 10 years has been great, and it's not sufficient for where we need to go. So I think we are actually coalescing around the reality of how long this is going to take. The second is actually, I think we are coalescing around absolutely no, whatever the replacement for silver bullet is, because I agree with you, I'm not a fan of it. It is, and sorry to co-opt this term from the other side, but it is an all of the above strategy. And we as individual philanthropists, let me just ask a question. How many of you wrote a check over the last 12 months to an organization that you support their mission of? Everybody. We are all philanthropists, and I can guarantee none of you take the same approach on your philanthropic approaches. Philanthropy is a deeply personal approach. So part of our job that we have to do is matchmaking. How do we, with the buckshot approach necessary, identify opportunities for folks who are going to connect with the strategy, the geography that works for them?
Building off of that, I think one thing I appreciate about working in the climate and energy space, and I've only been in it for about 5 years, I used to work more on water and sustainable food systems, is this alignment. So as a place-based funder of the Midwest, we're able to benefit from this global analysis of the pathways we need to be taking by 2050 to avert the worst effects of climate change, and then to position that within the context of the Midwest, which looks different, and in each state in the Midwest looks different than other places in the country. So for an instance, we know we have to electrify transportation or heat pumps. I know, there's like
Electric heaters.
other parts of the economy with clean electricity. The Midwest isn't a ZEV region. We don't have zero emission vehicle standards. And yet this is a huge opportunity for us to build an interesting coalition with utilities, health groups who are interested in getting rid of diesel buses on the roads, and school buses that are making it hard for kids to breathe, and environmental groups who do care about carbon. And situating that analysis and looking for the opportunity and pathways at the scale that we work in the region to advance and contribute to this goal that we have, since climate change is obviously a global problem.
I'll be real quick with the popcorn of something that I think is really exciting. One of the ways that we can leverage our dollars is getting ahead of something that we see happening in the public sector, which has, X-fold more money than we do in philanthropy. And so one of the ways we did that was getting ahead of what we thought was going to be a clean power plan, and really positioning affordable multifamily housing owners as solutions for utility companies. If we can retrofit all of those properties, it's a significant amount of carbon emissions reductions that we can have and lower our demand for electricity from those utilities. So we got out in front of that with something called Energy Efficiency for All. It's in 13 states. Georgia is one of them, Hannah. And we have been able to leverage $315 million in new utility spending, brand new money going to retrofit affordable multifamily housing. So it's those kind of efforts where we can get ahead of something we see coming down that otherwise may just be a little drop in the bucket, and we can put some money into it to leverage that and really meet the needs of the people who can benefit the most. And those are real jobs are happening as a result, as well as real savings. Someone mentioned, I think most Americans don't understand, many of us are paying in the hundreds of dollars a month, upwards of $800 a month in some rural places in Georgia, for example. And that's just untenable. You can't pay that on a monthly basis. And so these are real savings to real people, as well as real jobs.
These are all incredible examples of collaboration. One also that I would offer, and many of us are involved in this, so come find us afterwards, but the issue of refrigeration and managing HFCs has been mentioned, and ClimateWorks has organized a $52 million fund, a collaboration with foundations to address that exact issue. So come find us afterwards if you want to learn more. But Shawn, might I ask you to talk a little bit about Go Big and about this issue of we have 700 million, we need a lot more. How are we going to grow the pool of investment for climate solutions?
Sure. So, and I'll be really quick. So about 2 years ago, a handful of foundations, of which we were one and some others up here, sitting around a room. It was post-Paris, and it was like, hey, we're doing a good job, feeling pretty good, and we got a long way to go. And just as, and this is almost true, 10 years ago, we almost had added a zero to climate philanthropy in terms of overall funding levels. We're at that point where we have a sightline on being able to spend billions of dollars a year effectively on a multitude of geographies and sectors. So things we haven't talked about here, it's mostly been a US focus, but how do we get ahead of India before infrastructure gets built for the next 30 years that will literally break the carbon bubble? Or how do we maintain momentum in China? So all of this is to say, there was no vehicle in place to essentially go big on climate. All of us as individual organizations, I was just talking about this with Mindy, we all have to raise money for ourselves. So we've launched an initiative with some help with a handful of funders to literally build, think about it as fundraising infrastructure, and the client is climate. So how do we get more folks involved in this issue, regardless of what strategy or what geography folks want to use? So we've begun to build some of that infrastructure, and it essentially takes what my prior comment was geared towards, is it is an all of the above strategy. So we have to do a better job of servicing all of those above. But I think the other thing that's really important, and my colleagues have alluded to this, is we have done a better job of breaking down silos. Philanthropy, for all of its wonderful things, is like any other part of our world. We're siloed. You focus on health, or you focus on, whatever your issue is. And we know that climate is an upstream issue, and we've been trying to drive that message home for the last 10 years, somewhat successfully, that it's really important. But it doesn't actually meet people where they are. I mean, your powerful story where people, and your personal story of, I couldn't breathe when I was so that's not climate, that's health. So what we're trying to do is build stronger connective tissue with communities where they are more personal. Climate is very hard because it, in most cases, doesn't feel personal. There are other issues. So we've embarked upon working more collaboratively with the health sector. We're engaging more with food and ag. We're engaging more on global development. So all of this is an effort to bring more capital into the space. And then finally, I will say, because a number of presentations talked about this, is I actually think a lot of emerging philanthropists are interested in some of those underfunded areas. If you think about some of the new philanthropists, they actually aren't just philanthropists, they're investors. They're investing political money, private investment, philanthropic capital to solve a big problem. And I think that's partially what we're trying to do, is harness some of the emerging philanthropic trends. So sorry, that was a little long.
Oh, thank you so much, Shawn. This is absolutely a great segue into the last question that I will have for the panel, and then I'll open it up to the audience, don't worry. And so my question really is around this issue that's been alluded to through many of your comments about we need to make this a much more inclusive climate movement and really think about how this issue relates to others, how we can bring more people in. And so from your perspectives, what types of organizations do not currently have enough access to philanthropic dollars? Why is that? What are the barriers and challenges? And then what can philanthropy do to foster and support a more inclusive climate movement?
I can start just because we've been really looking at this. JPB, as you see when you Google, is fairly new. We got started in 2012. I was brought on in 2012 to start the environment program. So we didn't want to be a new environmental philanthropic entity that was furthering the divide and not addressing how we could build a more equitable and aligned environmental movement. So we've been taking a look at the landscape of organizations. So the big sort of largest environmental organizations have about, I think that's about 10 of, let's take the top 10, 2,000 staff, $500 million in annual revenues. If you then look at the 18 or so smaller organizations that have a reach in every single state across the country with members who are on the front lines, like in Houston right now, fighting Valero so that we're not emitting hydrogen cyanide in residential communities and schools. Those organizations have annual revenues of $80 million. That's nothing. And they have about 600 staff compared to some of the big green organizations. And so we've been intentionally, with our colleagues, trying to figure out how to get more money to those kinds of organizations that really have members on the front lines of these big environmental issues. And so that's one thing we're looking at.
I think philanthropy, especially the big funders, we're kind of set up to be able to fund money to the big groups, and that in itself means you're not being very inclusive. Hewlett's been trying to work on this. It's a work in progress. We're starting with a lot of work just looking at our own biases as program officers and who's in our network and who's not, and how do we start to become more aware of that and consciously work on it. One thing I will say is that I've noticed that in this room over the last couple days, I've seen some of that same dynamic playing out where this network, there's phenomenal people, and I'm fascinated with so many of the different conversations here, but it could have been even richer if the people on the stage had been more diverse in terms of gender and race and political perspective even. So I think it's a work in progress that we're all in process on.
Absolutely. So now we're going to open it up for questions from the audience. Moderator's prerogative, I'm going to have the last question. So what I will do is call on 3 people, wait for the microphone. If you could make it or a question, not a statement, keep it brief. So what we will do is take Osprey in the back, and then Jeff up here, and one more. Let's have the lady back there at that table. So Osprey first.
Okay, I'll go real fast so I know we can get to the questions first. This is a great panel. Thank you all so much for your effort to bring social justice into your efforts and diversity. It's two parts. One is a lot of us on the front line doing frontline grassroots work to build political movements. A lot of it is very spontaneous. Things arise. As you know, as program officers, that's hard for us on the front lines to mobilize when we can't tell you 6 months in advance that's on our program. Love to hear your comments on that. Secondly, I'd love to hear how you're evaluating data like Project Drawdown, that report in that book that came out, particularly around drawdown solutions as an example with women and funding. Of the two in the top 10 solutions, 5 and 6 are oriented towards women. When you put them together, it's actually the top #1 way to draw down carbon. If you look at the percentage of how much environmental funding is going to climate change and environment, it's tiny. If you look at how much is going to women in climate, I don't even think you see it on the map. I'd love to hear from you about that. Thank you very much.
I could, oh,
Yeah,
you wanna
let's
take the
actually,
questions
let's
first?
take all
Okay.
3 questions, and then we can
Gotcha.
address them just
Sure.
because of time. Jeff?
Sounds great. Good luck remembering all the questions. It was great to hear a little bit of discussion about direct impact investing. I know the McKnight Foundation has a direct impact investing program. Shawn, you mentioned it as well. So PRI, MRI, it seems like a no-brainer. What are the barriers to speeding that up, or what can we all do together to make that a bigger part of the impact?
And lastly, over here. Yeah, right there.
Hi, my name's Jackie Francis, and I run something called the Keeling Curve Prize. It's a brand new prize that's just starting. We're announcing our winners a week from Friday. And thank you all for what you do. And my first thing is that I'd love to talk to all of you guys about creating this network thing that we're talking about. But I see it as more of a cartel, because we're not really all going to agree on everything. So I just wanted to find out a little bit more about how you see the building of this network and how we can be a huge help to you guys in, vetting some of the people that you might look at with a bigger lens. Thanks for being here. You guys were great.
Any responses to any of those questions?
I can address the first part of your question. One way that we support grassroots frontline organizations is by providing multi-year, what we call general operating support, so that it's really supporting just the full capacity of your organization with the expectation that you can be as nimble and flexible as possible, knowing that this is such an, both politically and the physical energy system is changing so rapidly, groups have to have that flexibility. And so that's one way that we're able to support that.
Yeah, I'll echo that. We're trying to do more of that as well, and just look at the financial health of these nonprofits and make sure that they have reserves, that they are strong, not just for this year, but for years to come. So we do similarly multi-year general operating support grants. But after the Trump administration was elected, we went to our board, our president did, and got an allotment of funds that we can just we can respond rapidly. So, what's happening in multiple places right now, we can get a grant out the door in 2 to 3 weeks. So, I think that's going to be now just how we operate, because, Trump will come and go, but there will always be a need to respond rapidly, as there always has been.
Do you want to go? Real quick. General operating support, good idea. That'll help. On the Project Drawdown, what I would say is our organization would be happy to actually follow up with you directly on this. We work with a number of organizations, including Drawdown, on some of the modeling, because there are lots of models out there. But the point that I think you're raising for me is why something like Go Big is needed is there are, I'll use the example of CARE. My wife used to work at CARE. My very close friend runs CARE, which is entirely focused on, it's a global humanitarian organization focused heavily on women and women's empowerment. And they are seeing the impacts of climate much faster in the regions that they work than here. So how do we as an organization and as a community better partner with organizations that are on the ground, that actually have good infrastructure in place? And I think we're still just very early in that stage. Real quickly on the impact investment. Talk with these folks. They've done a great job. Yeah. Leadership matters, and McKnight has been leaders in this field. I will say that I think the biggest barrier right now is being able to, I think it gets back to somebody else's earlier point, the cartel. We don't all have to settle on the same way we're going to do things. Impact investment can be done in lots of different ways. PRAs can be done in lots of different ways. What we have to settle on is the North Star. We take our individual approaches and figure out right coordination and collaboration opportunities where if we're aligned, great, we go together. If we're not, I know you're doing that, and that information helps me make smarter investments as well. Impact investment is still an early field, but these guys have done a great job at it.
And really briefly, I would just say that a challenge overall is this idea of like institutional evolution that we need to ignite across all kinds of systems. And I think finance is one of them. And for a lot of foundations, it's honestly like a different department, different mental model. And so, I mean, I think one of the reasons McKnight's been successful, I'm like looking at Mindy, who is sort of like our guru and person who helped inspire McKnight to do this, but we've integrated finance with program staff so that we're looking at investment opportunities together through both sort of a grant-making lens as well as a finance, through a finance lens as well.
And on the women, I mean, I think we'd be remiss not to talk about the women because I mean, that we all care deeply, obviously, as do our male colleagues. But those are some of the bright spots. I see women in leadership of these grassroots organizations that are becoming leaders of national nonprofit organizations. And so we're investing in leadership as much as we can. And I think, you know, to kind of round things out, we have to listen to who's not normally in the room. And it's not always, you know, the women and the girls aren't always invited to the table. And we have to reach out and we have to invite them and make room and really listen to those that have been structurally left out of our economy, that have been discarded by our policies and practices. And we have to repurpose the way that we work so that we are including and making good on the #1, you know, drawdown opportunity.
Yeah.
You're here.
Thank you for our panelists. We are out of time, so if you could join me in thanking them.